Hello everyone, this is Travis Wright with you on the Bare Metal to Private Cloud series again. So today's session is on installing and configuring Service Manager. Last session we installed and configured Operations Manager. So in this particular setup, what we're going to do here is we're going to take the virtual machines that we provisioned out previously for the Service Manager Management Server 1 and 2, the SharePoint site server 1 and 2, and then the data warehouse management server. We're going to deploy components onto all of those servers there, and we're going to be provisioning out 8 new databases for Service Manager. So to get started, let's just go through a few concepts to make sure everybody's on the same page about the components that comprise Service Manager. And as always, please feel free to post questions in the panel there, and I'll take those questions. All right, so there are 8 databases in Service Manager. The first database is the Service Manager database. We sometimes call it the CMDB, or Configuration Management Database. This is the database where all of the configuration items like computers, the hardware on those computers, software on those computers, as well as service databases, websites, network devices, etc. are stored, as well as the work items, things like incidents, change requests, service requests, and so on, as well as the configuration for Service Manager itself. So that's really kind of the online database. It has the same technology platform that is shared with Operations Manager, so it is an extensible database that you can extend by importing management packs. The next 6 databases are all related to the data warehouse. First is the data warehouse staging and config database, and that database is used for storing the configuration of the data warehouse itself, as well as it's the first stop for data coming into the data warehouse. So it's a staging ground where we can bring that data in and take it from there. And the next database is the DW repository database, and that's a database where we store data for long-term storage purposes, and that data is optimized into a format that's designed to be stored for a long period of time. The DW Data Mart is the database that most of the reports in Service Manager run against, and it is organized using dimensions and facts and these types of data warehousing concepts. We really don't have time to get into that in this session, but just take away from this that particular database is the one that we run reports off of, and it's optimized for reporting purposes in terms of how the data is stored. The other 2 data marts, the OMDW data mart and CMDW data mart, are new in Service Manager 2012, and they store data that comes directly from Operations Manager and Configuration Manager. On the Operations Manager side, we bring in alerts into the OMDW data mart, and on the Configuration Manager side, we bring in power management data and software update compliance. The last database there is the DWAS database, and that is the database that stores the cubes for Service Manager in SQL analysis services. And lastly, there's a small database for storing the SharePoint site configuration for the Service Manager self-service portal. So quite a few databases. Fortunately, it's fairly easy to deploy those using the setup wizard. The next component of Service Manager is the Service Manager Management Server. This is essentially the same technology that we see in Operations Manager. It has the same 3 Windows services: System Center Data Access Service, which is used for connecting clients to the database; System Center Management Service, which is used for executing process-oriented workflows, as well as custom workflows you might want to have to interact with other systems. Service Manager's workflow engine is the same thing that we have with Operations Manager, so anything you can do in Operations Manager you can also do in Service Manager, including executing PowerShell scripts or your own custom .NET code. And in a given Service Manager installation, there's only one workflow server at a time. And that workflow server is the first server that you deploy in a Service Manager installation, but you can indicate that a different management server should become a workflow server at a different point in time. So you can kind of move it around as needed for maintenance purposes and so on. And the System Center Management Service only needs to run on that workflow server. It doesn't really need to run on the other management servers that you might install in your environment. The System Center Configuration Management Service also only needs to run on the workflow server because it's the one that determines what workflows should run on that server. And then lastly, the Service Manager management servers can be deployed in a farm topology to provide network load balancing for multiple consoles to be able to connect in and be load balanced across these multiple management servers. And you can use either Windows NLB or a hardware load balancer to do that. Okay, the next component is the DW management server. And just like the Service Manager management server, it has the 3 Windows services. And this particular management server serves 4 purposes. The first one is to execute the data warehouse ETL, or extract, transform, and load jobs, to get the data out of the Service Manager database as well as the Operations Manager database and Configuration Manager database, transform that data, and then load it into the data marts. It also executes what we call the Management Pack sync job, and that takes management packs that are imported into Service Manager and syncs them across to the data warehouse so that the data warehouse can then be extended by the deployment job. So this will extend the data model, it'll add in new dimensions and facts, deploy reports to SQL reporting services, deploy custom transforms, and so on. And then lastly, the Data Warehouse Management Server provides an API interface for the Service Manager console to be able to connect in and administer the data warehouse, as well as we have some PowerShell commandlets for administering the data warehouse that go through that API. Now, one thing to point out here is that unlike all of the other components of Service Manager, the Data Warehouse Management Server is not designed to be redundant. It's really not critical that this particular role be redundant because all it does is these ETL jobs and expose reporting through the console. You can still access reports through SQL reporting services. You would just lose the ability to view these reports through the Service Manager console if the Data Warehouse Management Server were to become unavailable for some reason. Okay, next is the SharePoint site. The SharePoint site is just a standard SharePoint site you can install onto any existing SharePoint server or farm that you have, or you can set up a dedicated SharePoint server or farm for the Service Manager self-service portal. This portal is fairly basic. It just provides these 4 pages on the site: the service catalog, the My Requests, the My Activities, and Help Articles pages. And there's really nothing in those pages other than the Silverlight web parts that we ship with Service Manager. So they're fairly basic, and really all the logic is contained in those Silverlight web parts. But having a SharePoint site does make it possible for you to easily customize the look and feel of the site, as well as add additional pages or even customize the layout of those pages that we provide out of the box. The next role is the Web Content Server, and this is a standard ASP.NET website. It is essentially a file share that the browser uses to download the Silverlight web parts from. And it also exposes a web service that the Silverlight web parts talk to get data into and out of the Service Manager database. And lastly is the reporting functionality, and that just uses standard SQL reporting services. And one thing to note there is that it's not possible to combine Operations Manager and Service Manager on the same SQL reporting services instance, so you'll need to use separate reporting services instances for those 2 components. Now, one thing that I just sort of want to go through here is just this concept of how we set up Windows NLB. This is an example of how we would set it up for the SharePoint servers. So we would just set up a Windows NLB on both of the nodes there, SP1 and SP2, and we would create a virtual node that can be connected to at sp.contosta.com. We'll see how exactly to do that in a minute, but in this particular deployment of Service Manager, we're going to create an NLB for the SharePoint web farm as well as for the Service Manager management servers. Okay, with that, I'll just pause and see if there's any questions. There's nothing in the queue right now, but feel free to drop them in there. I'll just pause here for 1 second. Okay, there's no questions coming into the queue, so I'll continue on. Feel free to drop questions in there, I'll answer them. What I'd like to do now is switch over to share my desktop with you, and I want to walk through a few sample topology diagrams of how you could deploy Service Manager. So hopefully you can see my desktop now and the Visio diagram that I've got here. In this particular Visio diagram, this is a deployment topology that you might use for purposes or in a lab or something like that. So in this particular topology, I've got one physical host where I have multiple virtual machines installed. One is for the Service Manager management server, and it has a SQL instance where the Service Manager database is installed. And then I have another virtual machine where the Data Warehouse management server and another SQL instance are installed where all the Data Warehouse databases are running. And then I might have another virtual machine which has the SharePoint site and the web content server role on it. So this is kind of a basic topology. You could even collapse this down even further by having the SharePoint server and the web content server running on the Service Manager management server. That's actually the topology that I use for my slimmest deployment. Is I collapse this down into one. You could also get away with having one SQL Server instance running on this machine and having all the Data Warehouse databases running over here. And then if you weren't using reporting for any particular period of time, you could just turn off the Data Warehouse management server and just have this one VM running where the Service Manager management server, the SharePoint server and site are running, the web content server is running, and the SQL Server hosting all of the databases was running here. So you could get it all the way down to one VM, unless you needed to have reporting, in which case you would need to introduce at least one other VM to have the DW management server there. It's not possible to install the Service Manager management server and the Data Warehouse management server on the same server. So this is one deployment that you could have where everything's virtualized. You could do effectively the same topology where it's deployed on physical servers. So this might be appropriate for a very small production deployment. You could use a virtual deployment for production as well. You could scale out and introduce more servers into the topology. So in this particular example here, we've broken out the web content server onto its own server. You've got a SharePoint server, and you've got the Data Warehouse management server here. And then you've got a separate SQL server for the Service Manager database and for the Data Warehouse databases. So this gives you a little bit more scalability. This would be good for cases where you want to have a larger deployment where you want to scale out your SQL Server instances because the transaction volume on the SQL servers is going to be pretty high. A little bit more advanced topology that you might want to do is something more like this, where you've got you start to introduce load balancing. So in this particular example, we've got a console connecting in, and it's connecting to either this Service Manager management server or this one. And then this one also introduces a Service Manager management server, which is dedicated to running workflows. So if you wanted to have an isolated server for running workflows that would not impact console performance, you could separate the console management servers from the workflow management server. Also in this example, we see that there are multiple web content servers which are fronted by an NLB, and so this will allow you to scale out the API layer for the consoles coming in through the SharePoint portal site. Okay, now this one gets a little bit more advanced here, where we've got everything running on a virtual machine host except for the SQL Server. In this example, we've got SQL reporting services in a farm topology with an NLB in front of that. We've got the Data Warehouse Management Server. We've got web content servers that are set up in NLB as well. There actually should be a line pointing here like this. And then we have two SharePoint servers set up in a farm, and then we've got two Service Manager management servers set up with an NLB in front of them as well. So this gets a little bit more complicated here, but provides for a much better redundancy. And the example that we're going to go through today is kind of a version of this virtual advanced topology here, but simplified a little bit just for the purposes of getting through it in a timely fashion. So We've got the SQL cluster here that we've already set up, SQL 1 and 2. We did that in, I think, the first or second session in the Bare Metal to Private Cloud series. There's a network load balancer set up that the console will use to access SQL reporting services, which is running on this particular SQL cluster. And then today we're going to install the data warehouse management server that will connect to the SQL cluster. And the Service Manager console will connect to that data warehouse management server for managing the data warehouse. And then today we're going to deploy 2 SharePoint sites. Well, we're going to deploy the SharePoint site once, but it'll automatically be deployed across the SharePoint farm that I've already set up. And then the console connects to the virtual node here on the NLB. And then we're going to set up 2 management servers. The first one will execute the workflows, but both of them will be available through the network load balancer for the console to connect to. So this will be the topology that we deploy today. We're basically going to be deploying out these 5 server roles right here. So I'll just pause for a second here and see if there's any questions. Okay, nothing in the queue, so I'll keep going. What we're going to do now is we're just going to step into the demo video part of this, and we're going to walk through setting each of these things up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a Service Manager NLB cluster. So to do that, we first need to add an additional network adapter onto the Service Manager management server. In this case, we have used Virtual Machine Manager to deploy these 2 virtual machines. So I'm going to go in and add a new network adapter connected to the VM logical network. Specify the VLAN, and as we saw in the last session, we need to make sure that we enable spoofing of MAC addresses in order to do Windows NLB load balancing. We go through and add the same configuration to the other management server here. Okay, then we're going to fire up both of the management servers. And kind of skip forward in time here, and then I'm just going to rename the network adapters on the machines so that I know which ones are the management LAN and which ones are the virtual machine LAN. Okay, and then we're going to install the Windows NLB feature on each server. This is essentially the same thing that we did last time when we were setting up the Ops Manager NLB clusters. Okay, so now we're going to fire up the cluster manager for network load balancing. And the first thing we'll do is we'll create a cluster. So we'll start on MS1. We'll connect to that first node of the cluster here. And we'll use the NLB network adapter. It's going to turn off DHCP on that network adapter, and we're going to assign a static IP address to it. Okay, and here we're going to assign an IP address for the cluster virtual name. And then we provide a name for the virtual name. So we'll call this sm.contosa.com or smms.contosa.com. Okay, and at this point we've now created the cluster, and it's adding the SMMS1 node to that cluster now. And once that's done, we'll then jump over to the other node of the cluster and add it into the existing cluster. Okay, so to do that, we just right-click, connect to existing cluster. Here we provided the node name of the first node of the cluster. We can connect to that. Then we right-click, choose Add Host to Cluster. Specify the name of the node that we want to add. In this case, it's smms2.contoso.com. Choose the NLB network adapter. Assign the static IP address to SMMS2. Okay, and with that, we're done. That'll add in the second node into the cluster there. And for those of you that aren't really that familiar with NLB clustering, a good cluster looks like this, where it has both or all of the nodes where it'll say converged here in the status column. Once you've got that set up, then you're good. Okay, now what I'm doing is I'm going into Active Directory, into DNS here, and I'm going to specify the static IP addresses for first the cluster node here, and the SMMS is the virtual node. And then I'm also going to create the static IP addresses in here for each of the nodes of the cluster for that new static IP address that I created for each of them. Okay. So at this point, you can see that I've got those new records in here, down at the bottom. And just to do a ping test, make sure everything's good, fire up a command window and flush DNS so that it gets the new IP addresses, and then ping each of the servers by name. Okay, so both nodes of the cluster, and then testing the virtual name of the cluster, that also works. Okay, now we're going to go on to installing prerequisite software on the management server. And on the management server, we need to install .NET Framework 3.5.1. Just choose the default through there, because all we really need is just the .NET Framework itself. Okay, now these prerequisites that we're installing here on SMMS1, obviously we need to install that on all of the Service Manager management servers and the Data Warehouse management server. The next prerequisite software that we're going to install here is going to be the native client. This is a downloadable thing that you can get off the web from Microsoft.com/downloads. Just a fast little tool install. Okay, and then we'll install one more thing here, which is the analysis objects. Also, you can download this from the same page where you can get the native client. Okay, that's good. And now we're ready to install the Service Manager management server. Let's go and launch setup, run it as administrator, install Service Manager management server, and normally you'd enter the product key there, but I'm just going to install an evaluation version. One thing just to pause here real quick, just so you're aware, it is not possible to upgrade a evaluation installation of Service Manager to a licensed installation. So if you intend to use the Service Manager installation long term, make sure that you install it with a product key, and that way, you won't lose any data and that kind of thing. And so, just as a precaution, I recommend people that, even if they're planning on having a test topology or whatever, go ahead and enter that product key because there's no going back otherwise. You can always uninstall it or delete your VMs or something like that, but there's no way to go from eval to fully licensed version. So, okay, so here it's checked the prerequisite software and it's noticed that the report viewer redistributable is not installed. This is provided on the Service Manager CD image, so you could install it prior to running setup, but it's really just easier because we provide a link right here that you can click on to just install that. This is just a real quick install as well. Okay, and then you can run the prerequisite checker again. Alright, now here we're going to connect to the SQL cluster. We use the SQL cluster virtual name to connect to. Okay, now this warning here, I want to talk about this real quick. So this is warning us that the collation that's installed on this particular SQL server is the SQL Latin 1 collation. Now this is the default SQL Server collation that's installed when you install SQL Server on an English US operating system. So it is a very common SQL collation. And there's really nothing wrong with this particular collation other than the SQL Server team recommended that we use one of the newer collations that shipped with SQL Server 2008 R2. And those are the Windows collations, and so we sort of warn people that it's better if you use the newer collations because they have updated code pages that have some of the new characters and some of the probably more obscure languages. So it's really not critical. It's just a warning. There is an entire big blog post that I wrote on SQL collation and which collation to choose and the collation compatibilities between the different System Center components and so on. I'm not going to go into detail on all that, but I definitely recommend reading that before you actually go out and deploy System Center so that you have a full understanding of what the implications are of the collation that you choose. Because once you deploy the Service Manager or any other System Center database on that SQL server, you're kind of stuck with that particular collation. There's no changing it. So, and it does impact the sorting of data and the searching of data in various languages. So it's a critical thing to get right the first time when you're installing the product, and so I definitely recommend taking a look at that blog post. I'll look up the URL and provide that here at the end of the session. Okay, so here it's prompting me for the name that I want to provide to the database and which location I want to install it in. So as we talked about before, I created a lot of LUNs on the SAN specifically for storing the data and log files for all the System Center databases. So those are the two LUNs that I chose for hosting the Service Manager database data file and log file. Here, just as we saw with Operations Manager, it's prompting us for a management group name. This is just a friendly name that helps you describe this installation of Service Manager. It can be anything you want. It doesn't impact anything other than just providing a name for it. Here it's prompting us for the Active Directory group, which should be the administrators of this Service Manager installation. So I chose domain admins. You can do whatever you want. Here it's asking us for the service account for Service Manager. So the data access service and the configuration service will be set up with this particular account, and it will also become the default account that all the workflows in Service Manager use to access the database. So in this particular case, I neglected to add that account as a local administrator on the management server, so I'm going in now and doing that. And this account always needs to be a local admin on the management server, whether it's a Service Manager management server or a data warehouse management server. And I'm also adding in the workflow account here as well. It's going to prompt me for that on the next screen. Okay, so now we're good. Next screen is prompting me for the workflow account. This is the account that all of the workflows in Service Manager will run under this security context. So these are just two accounts that I created in Active Directory ahead of time. They don't have any special permissions anywhere. Here I'm opting into the Customer Experience Improvement Program and to Microsoft Update. And now we're ready to install the Service Manager Management Server and the Service Manager database. So in this case, since I'm running it set up on the Service Manager Management Server, it's actually remotely installing the database on the SQL cluster. Okay, so now that we've successfully set up the Service Manager Management Server, it's prompting us to back up the encryption key. So Service Manager, similar to Virtual Machine Manager and Operations Manager, has a distributed key infrastructure for encrypting data on the wire. And the way that it works in Service Manager, each management server will generate its own encryption key. So you need to back up that encryption key in case you ever need to recover your management server by reinstalling it. So definitely don't skip this step, because you never know when you might need to reinstall your management server to get back to a good state. And so this is always just a good practice. You can run the encryption backup wizard after setup. There's an executable that you can run in the setup tools directory on the Service Manager CD image. Okay, so this is going to launch a new wizard that will walk us through the process of backing up this encryption key. Just provide a path to where we want to store the bin file that contains the encryption key. And also don't back up your encryption key to the same server. In case that server blows up, you want to be able to reinstall the management server on a new server that has the same name and that kind of thing. So in this particular case, I created a file share on my file share cluster, and I'm storing all of my backup keys there. And encryption keys are encrypted themselves, and you have to have a password to access them. So make sure that you keep a record of what the password is for that encryption key somewhere secure. Okay, so now we've installed the first management server, and now we're going to install a second management server. So keep in mind that the first management server is the workflow server for this installation of Service Manager. The only purpose in installing these additional management servers is to provide multiple servers for the consoles to connect to, so you can load balance connectivity across those management servers. It also provides you the option of promoting one of these management servers, one of these additional management servers, to be the workflow server temporarily while you maybe reboot the workflow server to do some patching or something like that. So we're going to go through essentially the same process here. I installed all the same prerequisites, so that part's all the same. The one thing that will be different here is on this page, it's going to prompt us for what SQL database we want to connect to. And here we have an option of either creating a new database or using an existing database. So we'll just connect to the existing database that was installed the first time we ran this wizard to install the first management server. It will prompt us for the account here, just like we did before. So this is the one that the System Center Data Access and Configuration Services will run as. And then you can opt into Customer Experience and Microsoft Update again. Okay, and that's really it. So since we already set up, and of course we want to back up the encryption key and that kind of stuff. Now, since we already set up the network load balancing ahead of time, and now we've installed both of these components in there, we're good to go. So now any console should connect to the virtual name of this NLB cluster, which is smms.contoso.com, and not to one of the individual servers. That gives us the flexibility of turning off one of the management servers, or maybe even adding some additional management servers into the NLB cluster. And so it's kind of transparent to the user. The connections to the management servers are all stateless. Okay, now we're going to install the SharePoint site and the web content server. By the way, I don't see any questions coming into the queue, so I'm just going to keep going, but feel free to ask questions. Now, in this particular case, I'm installing the SharePoint site and the web content server onto the same server. If you want, they can be deployed onto a separate server. So the first step here is to install the .NET Framework 4.0. This is something you can just download off of the web from Microsoft.com/downloads. Okay, so it doesn't really go that fast to cut it down. Okay. And then now we're ready to run Service Manager setup. We'll just launch setup as administrator. We'll click on Service Manager Web Portal. And it'll give us an option to which role we want to install. So let me just pause there. Pause here. Right now. Okay. So you can see that there's these two roles, Web Content Server and SharePoint Web Parts. You can install either of these onto the same server, or you can install them on different servers. One thing to note is that in this case, we're installing onto a SharePoint farm. So we only need to install the Web Parts role onto the farm once, because SharePoint will take care of provisioning out the SharePoint site to all the other servers in the farm for us automatically. But the Web Content Server we need to install on both nodes of the farm here. Okay, so first we'll start out and we'll deploy both parts of the portal. Okay, so all our prereqs have passed. And here it's asking us for the name of the website that we want to create. So I would recommend just going with the default name. There's really no reason to change that. You can install the SharePoint site with SSL or not. Just for simplicity, I chose to not install it. If you choose not to install it with SSL, you need to change the port number so it's not 443. Okay, and then it asks us for the name of the database server where we want to store the SharePoint site configuration database. Oh, sorry. This is the name of this is the connection of the Web Content Server web services to the Service Manager database. So it's asking us where is the Service Manager database. So here we need to provide the cluster name, so it always connects to the cluster name, and then we're going to select the Service Manager database in the list here. Okay, and then we provide an account for the self-service portal. And this should be the same account as what you created for the service account when you install the management servers. Okay, now here is where it asks us what the name of the website is we want to have for our portal. It can again be SSL or not. And then here's where it asks us which SQL server to create the SharePoint configuration database on. So in this case, I'm disabling SSL, changing the port, and I'm going to install the SharePoint configuration database on the same SQL cluster. Okay, and here we provide an account that the SharePoint application pool will run as. This can be any old domain account. It doesn't need any special permissions. Okay, and we'll opt into CIP and Microsoft Update again. And we're ready to install. Okay, so once that's all done, we're now ready to install. Actually, let me just show you some other stuff here. We got it. Fire up the portal here, and you'll see that everything will be working. So here's our SharePoint site. This content right here in the middle is the Web Content Server, providing the Silverlight web part there. You can see that it works on both the nodes of the farm. Okay, now we're going to install the Web Content Server role on the other node of the farm. Okay, so this is the same pages that we saw in the wizard before, where we choose which website name we want to use and what port number to connect to and where the Service Manager database is located. I don't know why, I always had the hardest time finding the Service Manager database name in this list. Okay. Alright, and then we provide a name for, or provide the data access service account here again. Okay, now things get a little bit tricky here when you're dealing with an NLB cluster, as I'll show you here in a second. So we're going to go ahead and bring up the web content server web service WSDL page here. Okay, so I'm just going to connect to that. You'll see the WSDL page will render here. So this tells me that the web content server web service is working. And then I change this to SP1, right? So I just installed on SP2, now I'm changing it to SP1, verifying that that works. Okay, so that's good. And now I'm changing it to the NLB cluster virtual name, SP:85. And we'll see here that this will give me a 401 unauthorized error. So I was kind of surprised by this actually when this first happened, but then did a little research on it, and what you need to do is you need to create an SPN for the data access service account for the virtual cluster name. So you can see here that I'm using the set SPN tool with the -s and then http:/sp.contoso.com, and then I pass the name of the account, in this case Contoso SM SVC data access. And I need to do that for both the fully qualified name of the computer and for the NetBIOS name of the computer. So first we run it for the fully qualified domain name, and then we run it for just the NetBIOS name. Okay, and with that, the web service will be accessible through the virtual cluster name as well. And then one thing that I didn't actually capture a video of is that you should go into the web.config file on both of the SharePoint sites, and there's a setting in there which points to the URL of the web content server service, and you should change that from using a particular node of the cluster to using the virtual cluster name. So that regardless of which SharePoint site the user accesses, they will download the configuration that points them back to the virtual name that is the NLB for the web content servers. That way they're always hitting the NLB for the web content server role as well. Okay, now I'm going into SharePoint into the central administration site, and I'm going to configure some alternate access mappings. So I just go into central administration, click on this link here, configure alternate access mappings, and we're going to create alternate access mappings for the virtual names of the SharePoint cluster. Okay, so we're going to click on Add Internal URLs. Click on, I kind of made a mistake here and started typing in here before I selected which collection to add this to. So this is disabled. You have to go up here and select which collection you want to add this to. So I chose the Service Manager Portal collection. And then you just add in the virtual name of the cluster. And I did this for both the fully qualified domain name and for the NetBIOS name of the cluster. So that way people can access the site using any of these forms of the URL. Okay. All right, so now we're going to configure SQL reporting services, and this is a little because SQL reporting services is remote from the data warehouse management server. So in that case, there's some specific documentation that you need to provide that's up on the TechNet library. And I'm going to walk you through the steps here, but basically what you need to do is you need to copy this DLL from our installation like CD image into this folder on SQL reporting services. So it needs to go inside of the SQL reporting instances that you're using for Service Manager in the reporting services report server bin directory, and you copy that in there. I'm going to copy that in there for both of the nodes that are in the SQL reporting services cluster. So I just copied it in there on the first node. Now I'm just going through a UNC admin path to the other node of the cluster to add this DLL in there as well. And then the documentation describes some specific XML modifications you need to make. So we provide a code snippet that you just, on our CD image, that you just copy and paste into the appropriate place in the rs serve policy.config file on the SQL reporting services instance. So the easiest way to do this is just to run a search and search for a code group with an open angle bracket in front of it, and you'll find that here. And then collapse down each of the code group elements here, and you can see that there's a code group container element, and then there's two code group elements inside of it. And you need to add this code group element that we provide you as a peer of the other two that are inside of this one. Okay, so that's a little tricky, but the documentation does describe how to do it, and now you can have a visual reference of what that should look like here as well. Okay, so we need to do this and then save the file. And then we also need to open up the exact same file on the other node of the cluster, which is what I'm doing now, and add this XML element there as well. Okay, and then save this file, and then there's one other XML modification that we need to make here as well, and that's this, and then there's this extension text file we provide. So you just copy the XML out of that text file, you go to the rs report server.config file, and here you search for a open angle bracket / data element, and then you want to put it in just right above that / data element. So right here, along with these other extensions, you want to paste in this additional line right here. We need to do that just as before on both nodes of the SQL cluster. We need to change that configuration file. Okay, now we're going to install the data warehouse management server and the data warehouse databases. So to do that, we just run Service Manager Setup and click on Service Manager Data Warehouse. And again, just as a reminder here, you have to install the same prerequisites on the data warehouse management server as you did on the Service Manager management server. So that's .NET Framework 3.5.1 and the native client and the analysis services objects. Okay, now here it's prompting us for information about where we should create each of the databases. So each of the top two databases need to be installed on the same SQL instance. And here it gives me an option to change the name of the database if I want for each database and what storage location I want to put each database in. And just as kind of a side note here, we do provide a sizing tool which helps you size out what the size of your databases should be. So that's downloadable as part of the Service Manager Job Aids package. And you can just plug in kind of what you expect in terms of the quantity of data that you expect to have and then that'll calculate the disk size for you. So here I'm installing the top two databases in their own LUNs on the SAN. Okay, so and then the data mart database can be installed on a different SQL Server instance if you want. In my case, I decided to go ahead and install it on the same SQL cluster, and just as before, put it on its own LUN on the SAN. Okay, now the next page will ask us where we want to store the other data marts, and these can go on yet another SQL instance if you want, or on the same as I did in this case. And each of these data marts can be on their own SQL instance if you want. So this allows you to sort of scale out the Service Manager data warehouse depending upon how much data you expect to have or how much you expect people to utilize it. Since the OM and CM data marts don't really store that much information yet, and they don't get accessed probably that often, I would recommend installing these two data marts on the same data mart or same SQL Server instance that you have the Service Manager data mart on. Okay, and here we're going to provide a management group name for the data warehouse management group. So this is kind of worth pointing out here, which is that the data warehouse management server and the data warehouse staging and config, they actually represent their own management group. And that's because we allow multiple service manager management groups to send data to that one central data warehouse management group. So this data warehouse management group needs its own management group name and its own management group administrators. And these administrators effectively become the data warehouse administrators. Here it's asking us where the SQL Reporting Services server is. So in this case, I installed SQL Reporting Services on the same SQL cluster where we're storing the databases, but that could be a separate SQL Reporting Services server or cluster. And in this case, you can see there that I've got two SQL Reporting Services instances installed on that report server, one for Operations Manager and the other for Service Manager. Now it's detected the SQL Reporting Services web server URL. And because we've already done the manual steps ahead of time, I just check off that box and can move on. Here it's asking me for the data access service, just as we saw on the installation of the Service Manager management servers. This is the account that the Data Warehouse Management Server uses to connect to the DW staging and config database. And here it's asking us for the reporting account. And this is the account that we use to configure SQL reporting services with so that it can query back to the data marts to get data out and render in the reports. So that could be just a regular AD domain account. It doesn't have to be anything special. Here it's asking us for the name of the database that we want to create the SQL Server cubes in and what SQL Server instance we want to install those on. And this is the account that is used by analysis services to query data out of the data mart databases in order to populate the cubes. And again, that's just a regular domain account, doesn't need any special permissions. Okay, and at this point we're now done installing the Data Warehouse Management Server, and you'd want to back up the encryption key here as well. And we've also remotely created all of the data warehouse databases, all 6 of them. So here I'm just storing the encryption key. Okay. Alright, so we're done with that now. And the next step is for us to register the data warehouse. So to do this, we just fire up the Service Manager console, and right there on the administration homepage is a link called Register with Service Manager Data Warehouse. You just click that, fires up this wizard here, provide the name of the Data Warehouse Management Server, test connection, click Next. And And here you're creating a run as account that will be used to access the data warehouse. So just choose the default there, should be fine. And then click create, and this will register the service manager instance here with the data warehouse. And that'll add in this new workspace here called for the data warehouse. And this is how you administer the data warehouses here in this workspace. And, dang it. I want to show you this. Okay, so this data warehouse jobs view here. Once this data warehouse workspace gets added here, this data warehouse jobs view will show here. And here's where you can see all of the data warehouse jobs. And it'll start out with this MP sync job. And the MP sync job will take all of the management packs that are deployed in the service manager database, and it will deploy all of those to the data warehouse to extend the data warehouse to store all the same data that you have in the service manager CMDB. Once that MP sync job is done, then the extraction process will start to kick off. So it'll start to extract out the data from the service manager database, transform it and store it in the DW repository, and then load it into the data marts. So that's how you can do that. And then there are other things that you can configure as far as the data warehouse goes. You can add people to the report users user role or to the data warehouse administrator user role here. You can create additional data sources to operations manager or configuration manager directly, and you can create analysis libraries. We won't go into that today. And then here on the cubes view, you can see once the cubes are all deployed by the deployment job, you'll see all the cubes show up here, and they're initially deployed with the ongoing schedule to populate those cubes every day at night. But then you can go in and view the status of those or kick off cube processing manually as well from that view. So hopefully that gives you kind of a good idea of what it takes to deploy Service Manager. There are plenty of sort of configuration things that you could do after this, but this is sort of the bare bones method of getting Service Manager deployed. One other thing I should point out here is that once reports get deployed to SQL reporting services, the reports workspace will show up here in the console, but that does take some time. It can take 2 to 3 hours to sync over the management packs initially, and then a little bit of time after that to deploy out all the content, including the reports. So don't expect the reports workspace to show up right away. That'll take a little bit of time. Okay, so with that, I'm done going through the demo. So I'll take any questions that people have, and then we'll wrap up. So I do have a question here from Joel. He's asking about, can you provide a link for the reporting services setup? I'm running into DLL issues. Yes, absolutely. If you just want to hang on here for a minute, I'll look that up, and then I can provide that to you. Okay, any other questions that people have? Okay, while I'm waiting for questions to come in, I will, oops, okay, so the question is, in Service Manager, is there a way to have users be attached to their computer? When I open incidents, I have to choose a computer to RDP into. So, yes, the easiest way to do this is to have Configuration Manager populate this information for you. So Configuration Manager has an algorithm that it runs on the Windows login events to determine who the primary user of a computer is. And if you have the connection going between Configuration Manager and Service Manager, we'll automatically populate that information into the Service Manager CMDB and create a relationship between that user and that computer where the user is the primary user of that computer. If you do that, then when you bring up the incident form and you set who the affected user is and you go down to the affected configuration items list, there'll be a drop-down right there that'll be populated with all the computers that that user is the primary user of. So it makes it really easy to add the affected user's computer into the affected configuration item list. Once the computer is added into the affected configuration item list, then you can click the RDP task and remote into that computer. So I hope that answers your question. Not sure exactly what you meant by it, but if there's a follow-up question you have on that, that's fine too. Okay, so there's no more questions in the queue, but feel free to keep dropping them in there if you have them. So Today we covered deploying all of Service Manager onto these 5 virtual machines here. All 8 of these additional databases have been deployed. And we are now ready to move on to the next step, which is to install Orchestrator. So that session will be on Tuesday of next week at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, where we will be installing and configuring Orchestrator. So since there's no more questions in the queue, I'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll stay online here for just a few more minutes to provide a couple URLs and answer any questions through the tool here if people still have them. And as always, feel free to hit me up on email or Twitter if you have some follow-up questions. See you next Tuesday.